The main argument I would say is, what are Americans? America is strongest when it has principles, when it supports people of principle, and it is enriched by that. We're not asking Americans to die for Ukraine, but we are asking to allow Ukrainians to fight for their freedom. The fact that the Ukrainian people without an army stood in 2014 when Russia tried the first time to take away eastern and southern Ukraine and defeated them, just quickly volunteering and mobilizing resources and showing great courage. That's an inspiring lesson, and Americans benefit from being part of that moral purpose. A country has to have a purpose beyond just the price of eggs on a shelf. If that's all we're about, that's not what the first thing that came to Thomas Jefferson's mind. They were fighting for freedom. They knew that there would be some hardship, but values and democracy and solidarity were the preeminent values. And I think Americans still believe that. And MAGA people don't want to pay for this war, but they admire the Ukrainian people, and helping them and preventing this inspirational movement, this inspirational nation from being defeated. That should be a U.S. priority.
Welcome to Talking Ukraine in English podcast. Our guest today is Adrian Karatnycky. Adrian is what I guess you would call a Ukraine expert. He's been working in and around Ukraine in many different spheres and positions throughout his career, from being a senior fellow at Atlantic Council to the director of Ukrainian Jewish Encounter to being the president of Freedom House and doing consulting and business strategies. He's kind of like the person, when I first thought about this this podcast, that would sort of be the ideal person to have on. So I'm glad finally, I'm able to get you on right at this time when there's so much going on in the Ukrainian world, especially in relation to America. So maybe Adrian, you can just start telling us a little bit about yourself. You have in back of you your Battleground Ukraine book. You've written this book recently.
As I'm a child of the Ukrainian diaspora, I have a Ukrainian wife. I have an apartment in Kiev, but I'm in New York now. I was in Ukraine recently, and I'm there intermittently 2 to 3 times a year for short durations during the time of the war. I'm mainly involved in Ukraine now on from an analytic perspective. I wrote a history of the modern Ukrainian state, 91 to 2020, 2024, that Yale published. I'm now working on getting a Ukrainian version of it out. It's the only history of the only single author history of the Ukrainian state since independence in any language, as far as I know, that tells the story through the various presidencies and takes it through much of the first couple years of the war. But it's really partly about institutional development. I've worked with the NGO sector, I've worked with the business sector, and in my research work, my journalistic work, my advocacy work, I've tried to meet the broad spectrum of Ukraine's political elite, civic movements, civic leaders, business leaders, oligarchs. I've pretty much met both the rogues and the heroes of Ukrainian history. Was involved in the early stages before Ukrainian independence in the defense of political prisoners in Ukraine and throughout the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, which got me on a path to work with and run Freedom House for about 13 or 14 years. Before that, I was assistant to the president of the AFL-CIO and responsible mainly for the foreign policy work of that office. For the head of the AFL-CIO, the American Labor Federation. In that period, I was also working on assistance to independence movements and free labor movements in Central and Eastern Europe. And when the Soviet Union began collapsing, we started reaching out to workers' movements in Ukraine. So I've had a very long history of concern about Ukraine, both because of my background, my family background, but also uh, because it's been interlaced with the career paths, the various career paths that I've chosen. And I think, I bring a long historical perspective. I bring, I think, the fact that I've had access to kind of many of the key decision makers throughout the history of the evolution of the Ukrainian state. And on all my trips, I try to you know, connect with people who are good sources of information about what is going on in government and civil society, and to some extent even in the cultural field, and I try to get a bigger picture of where the society is. And that's what I think I bring to the table. But I think everybody wants to discuss, the discussions around a potential peace, the negotiations between the United States and Ukraine. But I'll leave it up to you to take the discussion in whatever direction you want.
Well, yeah, we'll start there, but I think having your like sort of view of the inner workings of Ukrainian society over the years is going to be helpful in maybe explaining how things could possibly move. So, yeah, let's start with this frenzy of activity going on with this. Some people are calling it the Ukraine surrender plan that Witkoff put together with the Russian envoy that came out to be the American plan, but then there's people saying it's basically just the Russian plan that is being funneled through American channels, and then Rubio backtracking, and then revising it in Geneva in the last days. There's just a lot of stuff going on every day right now, it seems. Like what's happened in the last couple of days, and,
So,
and where are we today as we're talking?
of course, I'm only responding. I'm not privy to the U.S. administration's inner workings. I think that for a period of time, neither was Secretary Rubio, because he was not involved in these negotiations that were being done as a separate track by Steve Witkoff and with the president's son-in-law, who have both of whom have no knowledge of the history of the two countries, of Ukraine and Russia, and kind of just we're winging it. And I think we got a kind of a complicated. So let's start from the beginning. I think that what happened was that there was back channel negotiation, that the Russian intention was to create splits between Ukraine and the United States, splits between Europe and the United States, and splits inside the administration, by offering the tantalizing, using a businessman or a guy who is an agent of Russian influence, but uses and has you know, the connections for business, to offer some transactional goodies for U.S. businessmen who were involved in the negotiations, Jared Kushner and and Steve Witkoff, and I think that the reason Russia was stepping up this pattern was because there was a certain kind of coherence of support for Ukraine that was consolidating. And while Russia's trying to create an impression that it's moving, it's on the offensive, it's on the march, Russia is losing huge amounts of forces, and Russia is now facing a decision that will probably be taken in December, according to my sources in high-ranking, pretty high-ranking officials uh, in one important EU country, who say that the EU is very close to taking a decision in December, or will take a decision in December, basically allowing these several hundred billion in hard currency reserves that are held in European banks, and in particular in the Belgian Euroclear banking system, to be used to collateralize the equivalent amount of several hundred billion dollars of aid to Ukraine, for the military and for the normal functioning of public services, government, and filling budgetary gaps. That is a huge game changer, because I think Putin has historically been counting on the fact that given Europe's new impetus to build up its own weaponry and then to fill the gap of no money coming from the United States budget to cover Ukraine's needs, that'll just create so much tension and turmoil in Europe that you will have movements that are trying to stop it or to back off from contributing to Ukraine. But this 200 billion roughly in European hands is the equivalent of the five years of what the average annual US contribution was to Ukraine. And that would mean that Europe doesn't have to tighten its belt on social programs or run up deficits or, have problems with spending and budgets, because it can tap into these funds and use this Russian money to allow Ukraine to purchase and buy weapons and to develop weapons. The second thing that I think the Russians are worried about is the ability of Ukraine to do long range attacks on Russia's infrastructure in the same way that Russia every day attacks Ukraine's infrastructure. Russia is unique more so than even Ukraine, because if Russia loses a portion of its GDP because of the war, it doesn't have anybody to write a check to make up the difference. So if Russia loses 5% of its GDP, Ukraine loses it, it gets donations from the West to to make up part of the costs that it has incurred. But there is nobody paying Russia's checks. And when you think about it, 35% of the Russian economy is produced in Moscow itself and in St. Petersburg. So if you're able to disrupt electricity and heating in winter to these places through long-range missile attacks and so on that hit the infrastructure in response to Russia's attacks on infrastructure, that'll be a huge dent in the Russian GDP of several percent. The Russian economy is already sputtering, and I think all those things were the motives to where Russia wanted to show that it's moving. Plus, Trump started talking tough. He started sort of saying, well, maybe we can give Ukraine, allow Europe to buy for Ukraine Tomahawk missiles. We're going to put in really tough sanctions. The cost of oil is plummeting, and energy is plummeting, particularly oil, and that is a huge problem for Russia, since most of its government budget comes from the sale of energy resources, and combination of sanctions and global trends in lowering energy prices, especially oil, will make a huge dent in Russia's budget and ability to continue to finance the war at this high level. The other thing that I think the Russians are worried about is that the money that will be coming in now from Europe is going to be used more efficiently by Ukraine. Part of it will go, if the US continues to pay to allow Europe to purchase weapons, to buy high-tech weapons that Ukrainians cannot replicate. But Ukrainians can also produce their own weapons at a much more efficient rate. So maybe 2 to 3 times more efficient than the cost of buying similar weapons or similar munitions from European producers. The labor costs are lower. The ability to move quickly to replenish stocks is, despite the bombings of Russia, is better. So there are all these trends that, while we're hearing sometimes from the Trump administration, Ukraine can't win this war. Well, Russia cannot. Russia has shown that it cannot win this war. I mean, short of a nuclear attack, and which is unthinkable for Russia's place in the world, and something that would alienate it from China and from other major powers who, believe in keeping this as a taboo and off limits in the conduct of warfare. So I think Russia was faced with, a need to kind of stop these negative trends. And I think at least temporarily it has stopped them. It still aims, if it can't create too much turmoil, I think it wants to make it look as if Ukraine is the party that doesn't want a settlement, and maybe hope that Trump will say, well, I'm out of this. We're not, his position now is Europe can buy the weapons for Ukraine, and Europe can pay for this war, and we'll keep supplying those weapons, and we'll put in sanctions on Russia. But if Russia can show that Ukraine is not playing ball in terms of legitimate peace negotiations, then there's a possibility that the mercurial and unpredictable Trump can change that and say, no, we're not going to be selling weapons. We're out of it. Ukraine had a chance to make a peace with Russia. They didn't. We're out of this game. This is, don't bring us into this. We're not selling any weapons. We're not involved. We washed our hands of all this. And I think that's one of the reasons why Ukraine has been so careful not to criticize, attack, and reject various proposals that are put before it, but have tried to work with I would say, the constructive people inside the Trump administration, and simultaneously to take advantage of the fact that even among Trump voters and MAGA voters, there's actually a lot of support, moral support for Ukraine, and nobody wants Ukraine to be carved up or taken over by the Russians. Recent polls show that MAGA doesn't want to pay for the war, but they're happy with the formula that Trump enunciated. We produce the weapons, the U.S. produces the weapons, Europe buys the weapons, Ukraine implements and uses those weapons to prosecute a war. So Trump also has the problem that his popularity ratings have gone down. The economy is not moving fast. Inflation has ticked, has shown an uptick. And I think, given some of the polls show he's in -15, -20% negative ratings, which are even worse than his lowest ratings in his previous presidency at the height of COVID. And so when you put all these factors together, Trump is politically weaker at home. There are more Republicans that are willing to speak out, and they have spoken out. And Ukraine, I think, is not in a weak position. Ukraine is in a pretty strong position as long as it doesn't personally alienate the president and makes an earnest effort to try to find a reasonable peace. And so these negotiations with the United States over fixing first the disastrous Witkoff draft, then the pretty bad second draft, and now the third, what we understand is a much better draft, which still has some issues that can only be resolved by discussions with the two presidents. So that's a pretty long but uh, comprehensive view of where we are right now.
Yeah, Trump could go, it seems like he wakes up one day and he thinks he favors this side, a different day he favors that side. I mean, he just, posted this tweet like tearing into Ukraine and Zelensky like the other day. And then, a couple of weeks earlier, he put in these sanctions against Russia, which, as I understand,
And
are
said Ukraine can win the war.
yeah. So it's really, I think, unnerving for everyone involved, not knowing like which Trump you're going to get, right? But why do you think putting the sanctions against Russia, I think psychologically was a big step for him to do that. Why do you think he did that? And are they really having an impact on Russia? Like, could they
Well, I
change the
think these
calculus?
sanctions, I mean, yeah, some of these sanctions are not yet fully implemented. Many of them are on our allies and not on Russia, but the direct effect of these sanctions will be to hugely impact the Russian economy and the Russian ability to sell energy to other countries. I mean, Trump is a little bit unhappy that a small amount of money is still being spent by European states to buy Russian energy. But the big problem is that his buddy, Viktor Orban, is the biggest buyer of Russian energy, and he's given him a 1-year dispensation. So don't look for consistency in what Trump does. Look for impulse, look for some element of bullying, look for, a lot of transactional stuff. But, my sense is he wants this, cherry on top of the cake. He wants this he wants a peace. He wants to be able to broker a peace. But from the Ukrainian perspective, that peace should not be the kind of peace that, created euphoria when Henry Kissinger in Paris announced that, the Vietnam War is over, peace is at hand, and pretty soon we had the invasion of South Vietnam and the takeover by the North Vietnamese communists, with the United States basically washing its hands. So this cannot be a vehicle for, a pretend solution and then a walking away from the United States. And here, the discussion about what is meant by security guarantees, how ironclad are they? Are they treaty based, or are they like the former Budapest memorandum that doesn't wasn't ratification, it was just a declaration of intentions, not even of intent. And so I think the Ukrainians, having lived through that, will want ironclad assurances. Maybe it's not military on the ground. Maybe it's just we're going to protect Ukrainian airspace. We're going to keep it from Russian missiles, from Russian drones. We'll do it remotely. We'll do it from NATO countries, but we'll do it from further away. But I think Ukraine will need something like that. They'll need a quick trigger response that if there is an invasion, there is a reserve of weapons that can be pushed to the Ukrainian forces in addition to what they've already uh, acquired. And also there can't be, drastic limits on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. So I think that's the art of the negotiation. And all of this, and then territorial swaps, is that even possible? Will the Ukrainian public accept it, or will it create instability? Because Russia wins if there's no deal and it creates instability in Ukraine. So Russia's looking for different ways to damage Ukraine, to damage the West, to damage the unity of the West, and and these negotiations, which have been going on for many months, are a vehicle, or a disruptive vehicle, or vehicle for Russian disruption. Many people in the United States and many people around President Trump, I think, understand that. I'm not so sure that the president does, and certainly people like Steve Witkoff do not. I have a joke about, it's Kirill Dmitriev and Witkoff. So it's Dmitriev Witkoff, or as I refer to it, the dimwit negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, you think at this point that like the US administration would know that there are certain things that are just like Ukraine will never be able to accept, which is like giving over territory that Russia doesn't currently control, or limiting its ability to defend itself. And I don't know, it feels like Trump's outsourcing this work instead of putting in the work to actually come up with something viable. They're sort of like spinning in the same circles again with like the dimwits, and it's not going in. It's like we've been here we were here months ago, it seems like. And I
Yeah,
guess in the last few days, there's been a plan that's become more palatable to Ukraine that they've involved the Ukrainians in putting together. But but probably Russia will, dismiss that all.
right. I mean, I think there's almost like a rule. The more fair and, you know, and safe a plan for Ukraine, the higher the likelihood Russia will not accept it. So really the question is, if the US and Ukraine and the two presidents agree that this is what is presented to Russia, will President Trump a few weeks later walk back some of these assurances? And that's a huge problem for the Ukrainians. Uh, and Russia will, in my view, if I think I mean, this may be a controversial thing, but if Ukraine gets really strong ironclad security guarantees short of NATO, I think, you know, Ukraine can agree to, uh, I think Ukraine could agree to a relatively equal territorial swap of parts of the Donbass for parts of the south, and also Kharkiv and Sumy Oblast. But it would have to be on some reciprocal basis. It would have to be with a demilitarized zone and the resources for Ukraine to create a new, line of defenses, because in the Donbass there is a very effective line of defense that, if Ukraine were to cede that line of defense, would put them in a more vulnerable position. So there'd have to be some compensation. Plus, you would have to move. That area used to have 600,000 people, the area that Russia wants of the Donbass, that Ukraine does not want to give up. It used to have 600,000 people living there. Now there's more like 200,000. So it would require, if those people wanted to be resettled, and I assume the vast majority of them would not want to live under Russian rule, you would have to have some kind of a movement, free movement under UN or international auspices of people. First, a movement before the settlement, and then some kind of a process that would allow allow free movement of people uh, as part of the deal. But again, it's very unpalatable to surrender your own territory, and that's a decision really for the Ukrainian people. It's a hard decision, but I think there's so many elements to this at work that I wouldn't exclude that that is completely uh, unpalatable. We will see. But the problem for the president is, number one, President Zelensky is not President Putin. He calls the shots, but he calls the shots in accordance with society. Ukraine, after all, has a very active civil society. It has shown that they rise up and express their views to defend their democracy, to defend the correct direction of their government when it's going in the wrong direction. They've done it numerous times. And I think Zelensky is aware that he cannot foist that he has to take into account public opinion. So the next few weeks, it'll be the negotiation, but also the awareness that there are red lines for Ukraine as a government, but there are also red lines in Ukrainian society, and above all, there are red lines among the million people who are out on the front and you know the widows and the the people who've been maimed and the families of the victims of the war and the families of the victims of civilian killings. People have very strong opinions. And although polling shows that Ukraine is willing to accept a freeze at the current state of affairs and agree to try to reclaim those territories, not to surrender them, but to reclaim them through peaceful means and figure out some way in the future of pressing Russia to hand them back. But people are not willing to just walk away, given so much blood and treasure and so much suffering that has occurred.
Yeah, and I think this is a good segue, maybe into like some of the internal stuff going on in Ukraine right now with the recent corruption scandal with Enerhatom, where there were some, associates of Zelensky in ministerial positions taking bribes from, funding that was supposed to go to protect some of the energy facilities that, Ukrainians are suffering from blackouts now. And so those anti-corruption agencies that existed because people came out over the summer to protect their existence, discovered this, made this investigation, and there's been some calls from certain parts of civil society for Zelensky to do a shakeup in his cabinet, and he, at the same time, this is a critical time for Ukraine right now. So you want to show that there's unity and a functioning government, right? So this is a very like tough balance. Um, but as far as getting rid of his chief of staff, Yermak, it seems like that's something he's not able to do because they sort of function like a yin and yang, like they're sort of like a unit. He does all the execution, right? So I mean, do you feel that that Zelensky's done enough? Should he do something more in the future? Will he? Is he aware, or is he? I don't know. Like, what's your sense of like the dynamics happening with this within
I
his team?
well, first of all, we have to understand the overall dynamic is that the Ukrainians are, you know, they are very, I would say, the people are very sophisticated about how they see things. They understand that, if you've got if you've got a car that's hurtling 80 miles an hour on a highway and being chased by someone who wants to knock it off the road, you're not going to try to have somebody sitting in the back seat climb to the front and take over the reins of the steering wheel at that speed. Ukraine is in so they understand that until a new election, Zelensky is their president and there is no viable alternative. At the same time, he is losing control over his parliament because his polling numbers are very low. Even before this scandal erupted a couple weeks ago, involving allegedly $100 million of money that was shaken down from contractors to either get contracts or to get paid for work that they had done. and then bags of money being shifted around in Kiev, and even some of that money ending up indirectly in Russia. And the scandal is a bloody mess, and the problem is that it is much wider than what we already know. Already the scandal has gotten to the justice minister, who was the former energy minister, and to the current energy minister, and to a number of officials in Energoatom and other Ukrainian agencies. And it's also uncovered this, that the president's business partner, President Zelensky's former business partner, and one of his closest buds, was integrally involved in this scheme, as were the people that he greenlighted into key leadership positions in the government. Uh, but the scandal is widened because there is clear signaling from the anti-corruption agencies that are functioning very effectively, I have to say. Both the prosecutor, the anti-corruption, specialized anti-corruption prosecutor, and the National Investigation Bureau, NABU, the Anti-Corruption Bureau, uh, that the former defense minister, who was also one of the key members of the negotiating team with Mr. Yermak and with the chief of staff in Geneva and beyond, are also implicated. They're both implicated. Uh, uh, there, there are intimations which are going to. There are over 1,000 hours of conversations between Mr. Mindich and various government officials, which, according to the leaders of these two anti-corruption agencies, uh, point to malicious and uh, criminal behavior. There is a hint that someone who is referred to as Alibaba, which is the initials of the first name and the patronymic father's name of Mr. Yermak, was involved in suborning and trying to get the security services and the regular prosecutor general to open up criminal cases and to disrupt the investigations of these crimes, to basically not just to cover them up. And some of these agents who have uncovered all this stuff are currently sitting in jail. They've been sitting in jail since the summer. Uh, so there was an attempt earlier to take over these agencies to prevent this scandal from spilling over. So they knew that these guys had the goods on government officials. In the summer, that's when you had these big protests that saved the independence of these anti-corruption agencies. And now these anti-corruption agencies are laying all this stuff out. And I think my guess is Mr. Yermak will be soon implicated in this in a more direct way, as will Mr. Umerov, the former defense minister and now secretary of the National Security and Defense Council. Those are big problems for the president, and I don't think that they may go to other ministers. They certainly may go to other members of the president's office team. There have been allegations against other of his advisors, one of whom has already fled the country. There's also the mess that, the president had a very lucrative business before he went into politics, and he divested himself of a lot of companies in the entertainment business and put them in a trust for several of his advisors. But there are sources that indicate that some of the offshore structures that these companies had were used to funnel the money that was corruptly taken from the government budget and to export them out for purchases of real estate, investments outside the country, and so on. So all this is going to continue. And even before all this, he was losing to General Valery Zaluzhny, the former commander of the armed forces, by 65-35 in October, before this crisis erupted. And there are some indication that his support has gone down to as low as 25% from 35%. So he's a person, I think, who gets his strength from vibing with the public, of being embraced by the public. He loved the audience. He loved the the approval from the public. So I don't think I think his psychology is, I mean, he's a tough guy. I don't think he's going to go down with these other people. There's no indication that he personally was engaged in corrupt activities. And given his very substantial wealth in the tens of millions of dollars, I think it's unlikely that he would have been involved. And I think he's, passionately committed. I mean, we have to remember he's inspired the country. He's been a great advocate of Ukraine. He's shown a lot of personal courage. I just don't think those characteristics meet nicely with then being willing to betray the country and to try to steal money that could be used to defend the country at war. I also don't think that Mr. Yermak is directly involved in corruption. I think he is pretty dedicated to helping Zelensky. Obviously, he enjoys the power and the authority that he's been given. I don't know. I don't think there is any indication that he's personally corrupt, but the fact that he tried to protect the president by trying to stop these investigations and to disrupt them and to lock up some of the investigative agents who are still in jail now, I think that makes him, subject to it's as it was with Watergate. It's not just the crime, it's also the cover-up. And there may be a very strong evidence that Mr. Yermak, at least according to the intimations of these agencies, was involved in that cover-up. And even today, meaning middle of the week, the there was a meeting of the Anti-Corruption Committee of the Parliament, which is led by pretty good, strong, independent anti-corruption voices. And the head of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, indicated that they're they're building out their case, and that they're not stopping for, quote, geopolitical reasons or for reasons. They're just going and doing their job, and they are going to, whether Mr. Yermak or Mr. Umerov or any other government official is involved in sensitive negotiations, they're going where the evidence is, and they're going to lay it out in the courts in a sequence, and they're not going to be holding back until everything is settled. They're just pursuing justice, and let the, let the chips fall where they may. I think that's the proper approach, but I think the president should start thinking about building more trust in the team around him. Substantial, it's up to him to negotiate with civic groups, with the loyal, patriotic opposition, and also among the many reformers in his party that are alienated from this set of events, and try to come up with some names that are maybe not perfect, but have a reputation for, integrity, have something of a track record. There are a lot of people that have been cast aside over the last few years by Zelensky and Yermak, mainly on the issue that they may not have been sufficiently loyal rather than sufficiently competent. That includes the former foreign minister, Mr. Kuleba. That includes a former defense minister, Andriy Zagorodnyuk, two leaders who still don't know why they were dismissed, although many people, Western analysts and Western government officials, believe they were doing very strong jobs on behalf of the country. So there is a team B, and there's also some people who were in the past part of this who would be ready to step in and play these key negotiating roles, key governing roles. Ukraine has a reasonably deep bench. The bench is less deep because a lot of people don't want to get mixed up in shakedowns and a web of corruption and the potential risks, and also it's, but I do think he could create what we call a government of national trust, not necessarily national unity, but of mainly technical experts and well-regarded people in key government positions. He's not yet ready to do it, but I think there are some, there are a couple more shoes that are yet to fall. So maybe it's a millipede, and there are lots of shoes that are falling, but there's a couple more shoes yet to fall, and I think those shoes will force him to have to change some of this. He also, I think, has to change his system of governing. too much of it is concentrated in the decisions of the president. But that is his power is also weakening. And I think it's actually interesting that some people say that in the United States ratings going and Congress showing a little bit more independence, and a few people were more outspoken than they were willing to be in the past when Trump was riding higher in the polls. But with Zelensky's poll numbers down, some of these other politicians who were part of his party who just slavishly voted and did whatever they were told are beginning to ask questions. Some of them are calling for the resignations of Yermak and other officials. So I think we're seeing a good dynamic. But the most important thing is that with all this bumpiness and all this, turmoil, as it were, Ukraine has a strong constitutional order. It has a strong chain of command in the military. The society is united in discipline for the war effort. And the Ukrainians, they feel and they have the right to criticize. They have the right to criticize their government officials. And I think the president would benefit from going with the flow and widening the circle rather than, narrowing that circle and just relying on this very small group of people, some of whom, frankly, have failed to protect him from a widening net of corruption.
Yeah, I guess that's been the history of people who've held power in Ukraine, right? There's always been these business clans, and once they get into power, it's just about, seizing that power and using the levers of power to enrich themselves. I mean, that's been through the Yanukovych clan, that's even the Poroshenko, Yushchenko, and Kuchma.
Oh,
That's been the history, and I feel part of it is because the calculus versus the risk versus the reward. The risk is pretty low and the reward is high, right? Like there's not a lot of
well,
punish.
thus, so far it's been, but now it looks
Well,
like
right.
with
Is this a
agencies
watershed
finally,
moment?
yeah,
Like, is
yeah. I
this
mean, I think
different
these are,
than it has been,
yeah. But
historically?
let me say that, look, every society has graft, corruption, and so on. And I'm not sure that Ukraine is necessarily the most corrupt country in Europe. The level of corruption is pretty high, but the level of scrutiny of that corruption, the level of Western resources that in the past were invested in independent media and NGOs that track all this stuff, and in creating these institutions, the transparency of the ownership of things that open the door to this deeper understanding of how corruption works. All those things, it made Ukraine actually more transparent, but they revealed in that transparency, they reveal a lot of ugly stuff. A lot of societies have a lot of this stuff and it's covered up. And the other issue is how do you really deal with this? Ukraine was never able to cow its oligarchs into submission the way Putin did. The president potentially could try to do that. But, I personally think that the fact that Ukraine had all these other sources of influence never allowed, one person to consolidate too much power over the media, over society, over the criminal justice system. Ukraine has always been a bit messier. It's made progress more slowly as a result. But on the other hand, it has not fallen for the dictatorial temptation. And one last thing, despite the war, there is no appetite for a strong hand. There's appetite for a competent hand. There is no, we need a strong leader. We don't need our democratic rights. Polls still show that the vast majority of people want Ukraine to be a democracy, and they want to talk trash about their leaders. They want to be completely open and say what they feel, criticize, and when their leaders are doing something wrong, they want to come out. They don't want to. Right now, people are not. I've been speaking to some of the more, I would say, radical uh, protest leaders and civic activists. They're not calling for mass protests. They're calling for the president to understand what this moment is, because they understand that we don't want civic turmoil or civic strife in Kiev that would weaken the war effort. But here, I think, is the moment for Zelensky to kind of figure out where things are and to see where the public is at and how he can kind of reconnect to the public, which he did so well in the first several years of the war effort.
Is he seeing that though? Is that feeling getting to him, or is Yermak sort of filtering out the information that's reaching Zelensky? Like is
Well,
there
look,
that
I think
understanding on Zelensky's part of the situation?
I think he's still reliant on Yermak, and of course, the prosecutors have intimated by pointing to initials and telegraphing what is around the corner. And I think that, unfortunately, I think the president has decided that he's going to ride with Yermak until it is unpalatable and impossible. And but that I do believe that's coming very soon. That's probably coming in the coming weeks, certainly in the coming month or two.
Yeah. Now you were just in Ukraine recently, you told me, and in the last weeks, Russia's been heavily hitting Ukraine. I think realizing that this is a critical time and wanting to apply pressure. What was your sense from people you interacted with? What were they saying? What
Well,
was
I yeah, the first thing is, how resilient people are, how patient people are, and how people have kind of adjusted. I was there when, the blackouts only lasted 3 to 7 hours a day, and people, have predictable patterns around which they structure their lives. They figure out ways of generating power or having batteries that keep them going, or even candle power or whatever. People make, figure it out. I think it's going to get harder in the winter time with heating potentially being cut off for some periods and electricity for longer periods. But the spirit was pretty great. If you compared New York City during COVID with huge numbers of stores and other things being shuttered, you would still think that Ukraine at a time of war where 7 million people have left the country, a million are on the front, there's constant bombing and disruption of the economy. The Ukrainian economy is bleeding. But I didn't see any shuttered, most of the restaurants that I remember from 6 months ago, they're still there. They're maybe not booming, but they're functioning. They're making ends meet. I don't know how they're doing it, but Kiev seems pretty lively. The spirit of solidarity is pretty strong. And I think also I spoke with some pollsters and they sort of said, being drafted and thrown into a trench or into the infantry is something that, young people are not excited about. But polling and also kind of focus groups show that if there was a break in the line of front and Russia was making some major breakthrough, there would be another wave of volunteers in the same way that huge numbers of people came and met the challenge in the first days of the war, when Ukraine was able to recruit hundreds of thousands of people for the territorial defense and other hundreds of thousands into the armed forces very, very quickly. So pollsters seem to feel, and these public opinion experts feel, that it's not, it's kind of like a stasis right now. Ukrainians don't see the front collapsing. They know Russia is hammering away, et cetera, but they don't feel the urgency. But if they do feel the urgency, I think there will be another wave of recruits. And Ukraine, despite all of the problems that it has, and despite some of the mistakes that the president has made, like letting young men between the age of 18 and 22 leave the country in recent months, and apparently tens of thousands, maybe up to a couple 100,000 of them have left. There is still a large pool of people who are capable of being whipped into shape. And if you look at, for every population group in Ukraine among males, there's about 200,000 for every age group. So if you figure, if you have a pool of fighters from between 18 and 55, that's 37 years, and 100. And if you say half of them are unqualified, the others can be whipped into shape or are in shape. That's 3.5 to 4 million people. And with technology and the fact that Russians are losing 3 to 1 or 4 to 1, and maybe even 5 and 6 to 1 by trying to make this grinding attack, and especially in the Donbass, Ukrainians have a lot of resilience. Obviously, you don't want to see these lives wasted and lost, and if there's a possibility of peace, it should be negotiated. But the myth that Ukraine, that either the front is collapsing or the Ukrainians can't take it anymore, none of that is what I found in my personal interactions. None of it is what I found in the atmosphere. It wasn't an atmosphere of panic. I was like, about anger about the Russians and what they're doing to attack, and this constant attacks on civilians. And a lot of people have sleep pattern disruptions and there's some psychological effects, but not to the morale of the people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, just going back to America for a little bit, I mean, it seems the most likely outcome is that nothing's going to change, that things will continue as they are, that there won't be a peace agreement. And there's, Republicans like the MAGA crowd, led by J.D. Vance, who are saying this is none of our business. That's nothing to do with America's interests. We just need to focus on our problems here. And you've been an advocate for Ukraine and America, maybe for business investments historically, but just, generally speaking as well. If you had an audience with like JD Vance and that group of people, like what would you say to them to say, here's why Ukraine matters. What happens in Ukraine matters to the US. Like
Well,
what do
it
you
matters. It matters to, you know, the US in normal circumstances needs a wide alliance of democracies because the dictatorships are cooperating and working to undermine the democracies. And the alliances between China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, those are things that the U.S. has a strategic interest in trying to weaken. On the other hand, I would say there's another part of this, and that is who we are. The We talk about the greatest generation. Uh, you know, there were people who were saying Europe isn't our problem. The Nazi invasion let the Brits and the French and all these, there was sort of a similar kind of an isolationist move, and it took the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor to kind of to change the dynamic. And it is clear that if the U.S. shows weakness and its allies wither away, that somewhere down the line, that kind of a danger could come to the United States. We see already how Russia is using drones and ways of disrupting Europe and threatening them. Their television is filled with threats about invading and taking over Berlin again and marching into Paris and all of this. The Russian propaganda is preparing its people for much more aggressive stance. But the main argument, I would say, is what are Americans? America is strongest when it has principles, when it supports people of principle, and it is enriched by that. We're not asking Americans to die for Ukraine, but we are asking to allow Ukrainians to fight for their freedom. J.D. Vance went to Munich for the Munich Security Forum and lectured the Europeans, saying the Brussels bureaucracy is destroying the national identity of, you know, of Italians and French and so on, and these rules and opening it up to immigration and all this. This is all bad. He was complaining that the Brussels bureaucracy is homogenizing the distinct national identities of these people. This is just Brussels with a few regulations. In Russia, there is a state that is trying to kill and erase a nation. You call yourself a conservative nationalist, and you're defending other nations against some bureaucratic regulations. Here is one of the epic battles of national identity against an exterminationist enemy. So, from the point of view of his core philosophy, this should be at the center of it. And the United States was enriched by the greatest generation that fought in the Second World War when other people said we shouldn't get involved. We were enriched despite the failures of Vietnam and Iraq. It brought forth generations of leaders who became political leaders and civic leaders and even anti-war leaders. But the point is, our dynamic society is enriched when we are discussing and engaging in and pursuing our values and in supporting people who uphold similar values. And I think You can question some Ukrainian leaders, you can question their commitment to good governance or democracy or whatever. But the Ukrainian people, between the Orange Revolution, the Maidan, the recent protests, the the fact that the Ukrainian people without an army stood in 2014 when Russia tried the first time to take away eastern and southern Ukraine and defeated them, just quickly volunteering and mobilizing resources and showing great courage. That's an inspiring lesson. And Americans benefit from being part of that moral, uh, moral purpose. A country has to have a purpose beyond just the price of eggs on a shelf. If that's all we're about, that's not what the first thing that came to Thomas Jefferson's mind, or Alexander, maybe Alexander Hamilton, when they were fighting for freedom. They knew that there would be some hardship, but values and democracy and solidarity were the preeminent values. And I think Americans still believe that. And that's why, okay, MAGA people don't want to pay for this war, but they admire the Ukrainian people and helping them and preventing this inspirational movement, this inspirational nation from being defeated. That should be a U.S. priority.
Absolutely. I agree. That's very well put. Um, how about you tell us a little about that book you have behind you, Battleground Ukraine? It's a year book that you wrote that came out in the
Yeah, so it's
ago.
it's kind of like you know Steve Steve Witkoff, read this book. Jared Kushner, read this book. The book is really about how the Ukrainian state evolved and also how the Ukrainian people became more unified than they have ever been in their entire history, meaning in the hundreds of years of Ukrainian efforts, from the Cossacks to the effort to create an independent state in the aftermath of the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and the Russian empires after World War One, or the continuation of World War One, between the Red Army and the Ukraine and the White armies and the Ukrainian nationalist, patriotic, democratic forces. Uh, this book tells the story of how Ukrainian society has preserved a large measure of freedom, large space for civil society to be engaged, that it has never allowed the consolidation of a dictatorship, that there's always been punchback, and that sometimes, even paradoxically, when Yanukovych was concentrating economic and political power, some of the oligarchs were rebelling and trying to undermine him because they were worried that they're going to repeat the pattern of Russia, where there's just one big oligarch and everybody else is their flunky, and you have to, and you're constantly at peril of losing your wealth. So all these forces, it talks about oligarchy, it talks about civil society, it talks about the political elites. It's organized around the 6.1 presidencies that Ukraine has had, because there was a 90-day temporary president when Yanukovych fled the country and was removed from office by a constitutional majority. And so it's organized around these presidencies, but it's really just an understanding of the path towards where we are now. Why did Ukrainians become so resilient? Why were they so, in the end, so unified when they looked like they were so divided for many years of their historical development?
And if someone is interested to buy this book, is it on Amazon or where should they
Yeah,
go?
it's basically Amazon, or you can get it. It may still be on the shelves of maybe one or two stragglers at a couple of bookstores, but I think you can order it through bookstores. You can order it through, but I think Amazon is probably the best way to do it. It's whatever it is, Black Friday, so maybe there's even a discount, a discounted price these days.
Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you feel we should mention?
Well, no, I mean, I think you've raised all the right questions, and I appreciate it. Made it easier to kind of lay all this stuff out. But I think, again, the Ukrainians are not losing this war, and we have to understand what I don't think these negotiations, I mean, I could be wrong, will lead to a durable settlement. What will drive Putin eventually to, because Putin won't want it. If there's enough protections for Ukraine, I think he will not want it because he's out to get rid of Ukraine, not to
Right.
preserve it and to settle for just basically rubble that he has been conquering over the last 2 or 3 years. Uh, I think that it's important to understand what are the elements that will bring Putin to the table and finally get him to sue for peace. One, the ability to strike hard and to strike deep at Russia's infrastructure. Two, the long-term knowledge that there are vast resources committed to Ukraine's war and national defense and to its infrastructure. And that is by taking those several hundred billion in Russian assets and using them in a creative way to finance the gap. And third is that the United States is willing through Europe and through NATO to provide Ukraine with additional additional weapons, including long-range weapons. So those three things, and then the rest of it is the ingenuity, the creativity of the Ukrainian people, of the Ukrainian defense tech industry, and I think all those things coming together will bring Putin to the bargaining table and to a settlement that is, that is acceptable to Ukraine. I don't think Ukraine will reclaim its territories, and I think Ukraine is not going to wage a war at great cost to reclaim basically barren lands at this point. But I think Ukraine will bring him to the table, and if President Trump wants a Nobel Prize, the Nobel Prize is through deeper sanctions, getting that money to the Ukrainians, getting long-range weapons to the Ukrainians, and other things that augment what they themselves are producing. And he will get his Nobel Peace Prize because at that point, Putin will be so battered economically on the battlefield and in terms of the disruptions of its major cities that he will want to strike a bargain.
And this could be that critical year, I think, because this is the first time Ukraine is really hitting all these refineries and making as much damage to
And it is
the
doing it
ability
yet
to.
without the even longer range weapons to yet hit Moscow. It's doing it with explosive drones, and it is now developing longer range weapons, but it also needs the much more perfectly guided US and Western long range missile system.
Yeah, hopefully these recent negotiations will be the breaking point for something for the U.S. administration to realize
Maybe the
that
breaking point
this
of
is.
illusions
Yeah,
that you can
yeah,
sweet talk Putin into a deal by promising economic cooperation.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you, Adrian, for taking the time to share your
Pleasure.
thoughts. Some really important stuff.
Thank you for what you're doing. It's great that you're playing this kind of an informational role, and happy to chat, and happy to have had a well organized guide for the discussion. Appreciate it.
За свободу свою вставай до бою. Вставай!